Today we're going to be painting with watercolors, and there are 3 different techniques that I would like to show you. The first technique is called wet on dry. So the way that this technique works is I've already painted a part of my artwork and I let it dry completely overnight. And now today I can go in and paint a different color next to that part. So in order to mix up the watercolors, I'm going to dip my brush in water. I'm going to add that water to my paint tray and kind of mix it around. Notice I'm mixing with all the bristles together. I'm not sticking my brush in like this and like scraping it. You don't want the middle part of your brush to be digging into the paint. Once I've got the paint mixed up, I'm going to paint just on the tiptoes of my brush. So I'm just letting the top part of my brush touch the paper. I'm not pushing my brush all the way down so that the middle part touches the paper. That could damage the brush. I also have more control over my brush when I'm just painting on the tiptoes. You can see that when one color is dry and you're painting another color next to it, those colors don't mix. And that's one of the strengths of the wet on dry technique, is if you want to keep colors separate, you want to make sure that you let one color dry before you paint next to it. This right here is an example of wet on wet. So I painted this green with wet paint and then I painted red paint next to it right away, and those colors mixed together. I'll show you another example of how that could look. So if I were to paint my triangle purple, remember I'm just using the tiptoes of my brush. And let's say I forgot about the wet on dry technique and I wanted my purple triangle to just stay purple and I wanted the yellow around the purple to just stay yellow. But if I forget to use the wet on dry technique and I paint my wet paint right next to wet paint, this is what happens. You can see that the purple is spreading into the yellow. So I might end up with a color that I'm not happy about. So if I wanted those 2 colors to stay separate, I would want to let the purple triangle dry first all the way, and then I can paint yellow next to it. Sometimes you can use wet on purpose. If you want to create a cool technique, like maybe in this triangle I'll show you, I can paint just clear water and then I could choose a color, be a little bit of red, and I can dip that red into the clear water and it kind of explodes. It's like an explosion of color. You can also use pick up your paper and kind of tilt it to get those drips to look more interesting. You can also do wet on wet with multiple colors. So if I wanted to start with red, and you have to get a lot of paint. It won't work if it's just a little paint. Sometimes it helps to get a little bit of water and add it in to make kind of like, you almost need like a little tiny puddle, not a big puddle. If it's a big puddle, it's gonna get out of control. But if it's a little puddle, it'll help those colors to mix. So I've got a lot of wet red paint, and then I can add in a little bit of purple. And it kind of makes those colors mix and blend. And again, I can kind of use my paper tilting to create whatever effect I want. So that is wet on wet. Remember, wet on dry is when you let it dry first and then those colors don't mix together. The other special technique I want to show you uses crayons. So I'm going to pick out any color that I want, and the first thing I'm going to do is show you how not to do it. When you're doing wax resist, which is when you draw with crayons and then you paint over it with paint, if you draw those lines lightly, where you're not pressing down very hard, the wax resist isn't gonna work. But if I draw by pressing down hard, it's gonna work really well. So what happens is when I press down hard, I get a really thick waxy layer of color, and that waxy layer is going to resist the paint, which is why it's called wax resist. So I could take any color, I'm gonna choose purple, and I could paint over it, and those lines are gonna show through the paint, which is pretty cool. Now, if I do the one where I did not press down very hard, the lines aren't gonna show up as well because there's not enough wax. So I'm mixing up my paint. And you can see that the effect isn't really as good. So if you're doing wax resist, you want to make sure that you press down really hard with your crayons, and then those colors will show through the paint, which is a lot of fun. I did this example with painting an abstract painting of shapes, but you can use all of these techniques for any kind of watercolor painting that you want to do. It could be realistic, it could be abstract. You can use them for anything you like.